I'm sorry for being sort of the last one. Like keeping you here because I know how it feels. So, but I felt like my duty to give the anthropological bit, classical anthropological bit, and it's not. No, it's not. I mean, it's not.
The artifacts.
This one. But as an anthropological bit, it's more of questions and doubts than hard evidence and assertion. So it will be probably easier to digest somehow. Now, my I want to split my talk in 2 or 3 parts. First, I want to tell you the anthropological bit, and then the problem I had, and how I'm thinking to go further, and which are the questions I'm asking, and what do I think helps. And this is work in progress, and it's a transition, basically, also for in terms of methodology and theory. So I will be happy to get feedback on this. I'm very happy. So my work, my PhD work has been a sort of classical anthropological approach, long-term field work, immersion in the field, all these things, multi-sited ethnography. I use various methods depending on the site I was working on. So I had a huge bunch of data, very different kinds, hard to put together. But probably the most important part is that I didn't have a theory or anything I went to the field with, as most people know, but it was more the grounded theory approach, trying to generate theory from my data. The thing is that at the end of my analysis, I came across certain patterns of. I was working on religion. Maybe I didn't even say that. Religion, Eastern Christianity in Ukraine, Western Ukraine. So one of the things I came up with were certain patterns that were very similar to a theory that just came up by that time. I mean, it existed more or less in bits and pieces before, but it came up during that time, which pointed to the presence of 2 modes of transmission caused by alternative patterns of remembering and emotional arousal. People who are, I mean, there are many people here who also responded and commented on this theory, so I won't get into details, but the basic fact is that Whitehouse's theory looks at proposes these modes of religiosity, imagistic and doctrinal, which are different tendencies within different communities to transmit their messages in different different coding, which these messages are encoded in 2 different types of memory. So the basic difference from other anthropological works looking at the evolution of religions and religious processes is this bit about memory and different encoding in individual memory. Now, Whitehouse developed his theory and then proposed a series of variables to follow, which corresponded to each of the modes. I found this, let me see. Yeah, so why did I find it useful? First, because my focus was on the local religious tradition, and I was looking at the modalities of religious transmission, changes, social organization and religious knowledge, and their variation in relation to social changes. I was using the socialist, post-socialist situation, which created a great experimental condition, since religion under socialism in the Soviet Union, and especially in this area, which was one of the most religious ones, had to go underground. So all these things, all these things I was watching had to change, and to in relation to what was happening. And in the post-socialist period, when people say religion re-emerged, and there was a lot of institutionalization, creation of new structures, changing of religious forms, changing of the modalities of religious transmission. So it made sense to make this comparison between socialist and post-socialist situation. So I used my case to address more general questions and try to propose a sort of theory about patterns of reproduction and change in Eastern Christianity as one of the big Christian traditions. And my point was that the interaction between doctrinal and imagistic determines the specific evolution of the religious tradition. There is a situation of equilibrium, which I was showing through different case studies from my different field sites and in different periods of time. Now, I had a lot of problems by using this theory, and of course I was extremely frustrated at the end. Many of these problems were addressed by all the other people who commented in various books and places on this. But now I want to refer to the last one, which is the fact that imagistic religiosity is not really explained in this model. And I remind you what it is about. It's basically in the imagistic mode where you have these intense rituals that provoke strong emotions. They are encoded in episodic memory. The messages are like the codification is analogy codification using ambiguous associations. And White calls for considers that this imagistic mode provokes spontaneous exegetical revelation. So revelation has an important function in his model as a motivation for pursuing the ritual. I again have some comments on this. But basically what I want to say is that he's sort of falling back on Barth's work at this moment, on cosmologies in the making, and who tries to explain in a similar way how changes appear in a religious tradition, starting from the individuals who perform certain rituals. Now, in Barth's book is like the tension here, especially in this imagistic mode of religiosity, the tension here is in it supposes a lot of individual input into culture. So you have to somehow deal with the problem of individual psychology and how does this happen? What's the process through which the individual like psychological processes or what Obesek calls later subjective imagery gets into culture, and how this process is working. Now, Barth again in this model uses I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, actually, Obeseker's hypothesis, which works on a psychoanalytical approach, which says that, as you can also read, that cultural patterns are introduced during such rituals, which he refers to ecstatic priests, priestesses, and priests. So cultural patterns and symbol systems are introduced in the individual consciousness, worked upon to create a culturally tolerated set of images, which is this individual subjective imagery. That's the process through which culture gets to the individual, and objectification is the opposite process. And the idea is that ritual and especially ecstatic practices facilitate these two processes. So now, one of my field sites was a monastery where there were all kinds of unusual experiences taking place, from mostly exorcisms, spirit possession in exorcist rituals, but much more than this. Trance, seeing, people had the gift of seeing, dreams, visions, all the experiences that people would call unusual, and anthropologists would some anthropologists would find interesting to pursue. Now, I've been trying to work, like, one of the puzzles I had was that the theory I used didn't explain at all and didn't make me move from this individual level to the social level and back somehow. So what the anthropologist does in the film, and at least I mean in a short version of it and probably incomplete, that's a quotation from one of the monks in my monastery. You watch The Exorcist and it reminds you how close the devil is. So there is an everyday presence of divine agents, or what we can call them in many ways, who interact and become part of the reality of these monks and of people who come to the monastery. So what I've been trying to do is to understand how divine agents become present in their daily life and how they come to influence reality. So looking at practices, discourses, that's the typical anthropological stuff. Ethnographic descriptions of revelatory religious experiences. These are all part of what Whitehouse calls imagistic religiosity. The more visible aspects, trance, fainting, hallucinations, a lot. Then there's the level of eliciting emic interpretations of these experiences. So people insisting that what happened is out of the ordinary, is out of it's not an ordinary sensory or cognitive experience. And then trying all kinds of post-fieldwork interpretations. That's the work of the anthropologist's imagination, basically, to see what works. Now, the problem with these things is these kind of processes, like spirit possession, is that they've been such unusual experiences. They've been used a lot in the construction of psychiatric illnesses. So until recently, you had a lot of psychiatric disorders, syndromes constructed around symptoms that appear in such states, like trances or possession, spirit possession trances, and all kinds of things. So you had schizophrenia, multiple personality, epilepsy, and anthropologists have been trying hard, some of them, to take it out from psychiatry and bring it back, sort of, let's see it as what people see as religious experience. So you have this typical case of the shamanistic schizophrenia debate. You have the altered state of consciousness approach that says that basically what happens is that there is an altered, that's all in what happens at the individual, the psychological level. Yeah? But you have other anthropologists who come and say that there is a special mental process that takes place in this. So another form of cognition, of consciousness, or a distinct mode of cognition. And then I enumerate some of them. I'm sure there are much more, and which appear. So basically, what we are dealing with in this case of let's take possession, as it happens in the monastery, possession in relation to exorcism, is you have an enhanced mental imagery, which Knowles describes also in the case of shamanism, but appears in many contexts related to these unusual experiences. You have a series of somatic experiences which I described earlier. You have strong emotions, and you have a ritual context which is basically it becomes a counterintuitive context. I won't go into all these details. Maybe I'll come back to it. But the basic thing is that these experiences, unusual experiences, let's call, become meaningful only under guidance. So they are not. It doesn't happen in the end only at the individual level, but there is, at least in the monastery, there is at least one person who, even if you have such an experience as a monk, you would go and share it with, and he would actually define it, what type of experience it is. So it's never the individual experience, religious experience. Still, in the moment, at some point after this definition appears, like discernment, which is a huge problem in the history of exorcism and spirit possession, they become part of a new mode of orientation in the world for that specific person who had this experience. Now, I'm interested to look into this kind of experience in different ways than what has been proposed before. And this is the part I'm sort of sliding, moving away from, trying to move away from what has been done in anthropology and go closer to psychology. So I have 3 cases on which, as I tell you, this is project. I have 3 cases from my fieldwork. One is a nun who has visions of the Virgin Mary. She's 24 years old. She has private visions, but her visions become sort of popular in the monastery, and through her visions she starts running the entire business. I have the case of a young novice, who she was also a novice before, but she became a nun, who is 19-year-old. He's not anymore in the monastery actually, but he was at the time I was there, and who has a lot of, he has a gift of being possessed by he's often possessed by the Holy Spirit. He's painting icons under the influence of the Holy Spirit, which in the Orthodox theology is something, iconography is something very important. I mean, it's the actual thing. But if you look at it, he's actually painting after a model. However, he's one of the people who see, as the nun, who sees things in the monastery. So I'm interested to follow this, what is going on with them, what type of religious experience they have. And then I have the case of a former convict, a guy who found his place in the monastery after being converted in prison, and who doesn't see anything. Yeah, exactly. So what's the matter with him? He's trying hard to see, and he's very modest, because you have in Orthodoxy you have this modesty of. I mean, you have it in monastic traditions, but especially here you have a lot of penitence and modesty. So he's in his own modesty. He's saying, "Look, I'm trying, but I don't make it." But the others do.
Which one is it?
This is the monk. This is just a pilgrim who was also exorcised, but that's the right is the monk. So the idea that I'm trying to follow is that, and following a certain literature which the one I mentioned before from anthropology, is religious specialists have developed techniques to cultivate enhanced mental imagery. And here I refer to a specific domain in neuroimaging, which has dealt with mental imagery, just to make it clear. It's not something that anthropologists invented. And access a specific mode of knowledge, producing, there's another body of literature in anthropology saying that these kind of rituals actually produce new knowledge. There's innovation and creativity involved in such rituals. And it triggers a particular experience of the divine, who becomes something very close and entertaining and private. So it's not only religious specialists like in other religions who can train this function, but you have my monks who can train it also. And some people outside who try to train it. But you have it, for example, in charismatic movements nowadays, in Pentecostalism and all this, who train it intensively and who manage to have such experiences. And you can, I can make reference to Tanya Zurman's work, who is looking at this, exactly how people create this experience. So the question is, are we looking at the process of learning? Learning religion, learning to experience, to have a certain kind of experience, learning to have a revelatory experience. And I'm trying to get into it by looking at the role of imagination. What's the imagination, what's the role of imagination in this process, and where is the creativity coming into? So, to do this, I'm looking at developmental psychology. Now, yeah, as I said, there is a large body of literature in both anthropology and psychology commenting on religious thinking, magical thinking, religious thinking, characterized first as a primitive or an early stage in cognitive development, which change, and you have an edited book by Rosengren and Paul Harris's work, which sort of rethink imagination and its role in human evolution, and they look at how children develop magical and metaphysical thinking and address this problem of religious thinking. On the other hand, you have also Pascal Boyes has an article on sort of the knowledge, the different mechanisms that are precursors of creative imagination, but that doesn't help me much at this stage. So you have children's imagination at work. Basically, the idea put forward by Harris is that there is no difference. I mean, this magical thinking is not a primitive kind of mode of cognition, or it's not a primitive stage in human cognition, but it continues and it develops and it exists in adults also. So I can actually look at his work on children and address it to my novices who are like children in this kind of experience. So you have make-believe or fictional world, all these things that children do. This is basically the functions of imagination in children, as he describes it, and not only. And is addressing this issue of imaginative infusion into reality, which is the one that that is interesting for me at this stage in the monastery. And the explorations. So how to understand the novices? This again, it's more of what I'm thinking to put together now, and it's not necessarily something that is valid. These are, you can put question marks. You have contextual learning, which is done especially through ritual, as the monk said, which reinforces a certain presence of divine agents. But you have also a psychological process, which Luhrmann addresses, and not only absorption, in which happens in most of these types of experiences, where people sort of lose contact with the perceptual world and focus more on the internal world and become absorbed into themselves, focusing on the inner eye sort of experience. But you have a systematic visualization practice, which is done a lot in the monastery through, for example, praying to the icons and all kinds of other things. But you have also a cultivation of, I'm not sure to call it, I mean, Johnson calls it metaphysical thinking, but there's the tendency towards like attributing all kinds of intentions to transcendental agents rather than to human agents. And you have a lot of this happening, which is the imaginative infusion into reality, which actually creates the experience of participation, of the fact that God or these agents, spiritual agents, are present in your life and are next to you. There is imaginal conditioning. There are studies both. I mean, in this edited volume, there's a study on different cultural contexts or religious contexts, like work with Unitarian and Catholics, and how they imagine, how these religious, how they imagine divine agents and transcendental intentionality. But there's also some anthropological evidence on this that you can would train, but also in a certain way your imaginative function is conditioned by the cultural environment. And you have to make a connection with creativity. You have earlier work where ritual is actually seen as the flow-producing behavior, the one that leads to creativity. And I think there's more on this done. I mean, I'm sure there's more, but I didn't get to the entire thing. So just to end with it, it's why imaginations, and this is like, is it imagination or imaginations, because it's not really clear, again, in neither of the literatures. It's important for anthropologists, first of all, I think, and it's not really addressed so much. So it's a constitutive, as well as emotions, of both being there and of writing up in anthropological work. So we shouldn't give it up, please. It's connected very much to religious experiences. This is what there's a lot of evidence in these directions. It is a prerequisite for creativity, including religious creativity, and it emerges early in children and lasts a long time. And much more than this, but I have to finish. Thank you for the patience. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of literature. You have 19th century psychology of religion and psychiatry trying to prove these things are not really working. So taking people to the labs and doing experiments. And you have, in psychiatry, you have a lot of, there are several books discussing exactly this, like commenting on this tension between psychiatry and religion when psychiatry emerges as a science. He's neither interpreting himself as having schizophrenia by himself. Yeah. So it's true. I mean, it's a cultural construction of symptoms and illness at the same time. So, and you have alternative etiological systems, and then you go around. Yeah.
I'll just say one thing. I mean, it seems to me that it's probably misleading to just look at spectacular moments when people are possessed. Because you've got to think of them as going through their lives, brought up in families where all these things are assumed to be there. And so obviously it's important to look at these moments. But you can only understand these moments in terms of those already constructed lives and already constructed social systems. And a lot of the theories that you're talking about seem to be to say, oh gosh, there's these exciting things, let's try to explain them. But you must start with people who are in a religious world. And then, you know, it's not very surprising. I mean, all theories which sort of try to explain religious events from a zero base are misleading.
That's one of the problems with the theories that exist. It's true. They are not all the same, though. But I use this also. I mean, I had the same problem in my thesis. And it helped a lot looking at the entire religious tradition and how people, like how these rituals function in the context.
I mean, you first of all have to assume that the Virgin Mary is there at the door, which I think most Catholics do anyway, for before you explain the fact that she just appears at this moment. And so you need to have a much more. And I think you need to also put the religion in terms of these general things. What I was trying to explain in my first talk is that actually there's so many other aspects of social life which are just the same, assuming, totally possibly invisible entities. Indeed, I think that many are.
Just a short question, Vlad, about, it seems to me that the way you see religious learning is very linear, and I was wondering how you would include in your description of religious learning issues of doubt and skepticism in learning. Because we have many examples from Lévi-Strauss and his famous example of the shaman who is doubting about what's happening to him. How do you include in your description those moments of hesitation, doubts, and skepticism related to the discovery of the symptoms, the discovery of the presence of the entity? So,
I mean, it goes in the same direction. That's why I'm talking about process, and that's why I am trying to look at it as a process. And I talk about these concrete cases within the context and looking at the life trajectories. But it's part of creating this experience, actually, doubting and validating. It's in a dynamic.
I just have a factual question. You started out by talking about situating this work and studying the transition between religion and the socialist period and the post-socialist, but you didn't say anything about that. So are these phenomena, is this a change from what was happening when it was underground? I mean, well, how does what you present here relate to that aspect of your case studies?
That was my classical anthropological work. Not in this form, they existed. They exist and they are an important part. I mean, these unusual experiences or imagistic practices, they exist and they are an important part of the religious tradition and of this history. So, not in this particular form they existed and they were used in the underground church, basically, and the underground religious practice. And it's much more interesting to compare how they came out and became so spectacular now when they existed and they had the same aspect before.
Concerning White House's theory, I agree with you that it's quite hard to understand how the two modes of the two components mix up in a balanced system. And your filter would be really, I think, a very useful case to clear up things there, because what your situation seems to be is that you have an institutionalized, that is very doctrinal context, like a monastery, in which you have imagistic events like visions and things like that, which is also being institutionalized at the moment, because there is somebody who tries to learn it. An imagistic thing cannot be learned the same way as you can learn the dogmas of your religion. So if you could sort out those things, would be, I think, a very important contribution to White House's work. And in that respect, what I suggest to you, or what is interesting, is that there is a PhD student in Belfast, Dimitris Sigalatas, if I'm not mistaken, and he works on Eastern Christianity, Greek Orthodoxy, and imagistic practices like firewalking. And he is also going into the direction of what neurological correlates can be. So what might be a useful direction, or if you want to take it as a question, if you want to take it as a suggestion, is to find out what are the techniques that make somebody have such visions. So
I did it already. Because I mean that the interesting case of Eastern Christianity is this one, that it's supposedly, and this is where the theory doesn't really work. It's a doctrinal tradition, and it has actually a long tradition, but at its center there's mysticism, there's a lot of these hesychast prayers, and there's a lot of personal experience, and it's anyway we can talk.
The question is what states or what actions or what practices bring those personal experiences.
Okay.
Okay.
I think they're really out of time, so let's postpone it.
Thank